I don't know how much I really need to say, I guess, like considering that we kind of came from, I know, would everyone be able to say in the chat how many people were not here from the last session, just so we have an idea, because I think that would be helpful.
Oh yeah, there is some.
I was in and out with the electricity.
In and out. Okay. I'll keep it really simple and really short if I can, but basically my perspective is I'm Stacey. I'm a senior research fellow in the School of Design at Northumbria University. My perspective is around this idea of death online in relation to design and making. So the kind of the processes and the way that we make systems and the influence that we have as people and as the makers constructing the kind of the interface between the other side, the way that people respond to it and the way that people understand those systems and the way that they engage with it. And I think for me, some of the stuff I was referring to earlier, so some of the work that I've been doing, I see my research and my work as intrinsically public, that my engagement with publics and peoples is interwoven into my research. And so the work that I do with libraries, with hospices, with also at the moment with scientists as part of the Human Cell Atlas project, which is around posthumous data donation and around donation of bodies and organs and tissue and the way that people engage and trust or don't trust in scientific institutions, is all kind of linked into this question of helping to engage with choice at the end of life and helping people to understand that those choices stem from our physical bodies into those digital bodies or information bodies or whatever you want to call them, or otherwise extensions of self. And that to help people come to a point, I think, where they can think about those things, my approach has always been to work with kind of institutions and explore how they can use their voices. So in the case of libraries, that books are ways that we often experience death and dying in kind of non-critical, not risk-free, but sort of, you know, in an environment where we can test and play with the concept of death. And that's why things like science fiction books often play with different concepts around philosophical and other concepts around death and dying. And I think that sometimes there is, sorry, I've just noticed some comments in the chat that I want to respond to, but sometimes there is, you need to open those conversations out and people need some years to work on it and to think on it in their heads before they can get to a point of being able to deal with it. And I think that working with the libraries for me has been so exciting because it kind of helps people to explore these ideas before they're at a point of crisis, before they enter that bereavement, before they lose anyone. And where they're just a citizen walking into their library and they engage or encounter something. And that's really interesting for me. And with the data project that the others were asking about, so data donation, that's a project, I can actually show you one of the, because I have it on the thing. So it's a project, we've started building some of these kind of toolkits. And they're kind of, there's this little petri dish that helps people explore their opinions towards science and towards the so sort of, do they trust, are different types of tissue donation from the body different to them? So reproductive cells, tumor cells, other things. And then this little person here, which helps people to think about and explore questions around data and legacy. And so I've got this, one of them is a prompt here. Don't know if you guys can see it, but it sort of says on the body, what data would you be willing to share? And it has included in there medical records after death, which is the kind of posthumous data, data from health tracking apps or genomic data. And they're about exploring with people how something like organ donation, which is something that Adina talks about in one of her papers, actually. I think that's sort of the interest there, how things like organ donation could be comparable to something like posthumous data donation, whereby people perhaps might feel like there's a social need or a social cause with which that they could give their data. Sorry, that's a lot longer than I wanted to go into, but I just saw the questions in the chat, so apologies for slightly going over potentially.
I have a question, Stacey. I may agree. I think that project's great, and I think it's the point you're making about helping people engage in choices about the end of life, not just at the end of life, you know, but beforehand. And with respect to data in specific, We know that there are some choices that people do not make. We know that there are choices that people cannot make because they're not currently technically or legally possible, for example, or that they might try to make, but they're not technically or legally possible. Do you think that there are some choices with respect to the use of one's data post-mortem that should not be made, or that, you know, and I was going to give an example, but I'm not going to do it, but I'm just going to leave it there. Are there some choices that should not be okay, or that, you know, are there problems with certain kinds of choices for your data in its use post-mortem?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there are tons of problems, and that, you know, there are lots of examples where that shouldn't be shared or shouldn't be used. With the posthumous medical data, for example, there is a various papers that talk about this idea that if your genetic code or your genetic data implicates someone else in your family who has the same condition or the same illness or the same, then you should be excluded without your choice from that collection. So they basically say that they don't think that people's data that identifies other people should be included in those collections. But the point I think that's being made as well is that if we don't start collecting some of these kinds of digital data about body or medical things, then they end up being bought up by companies like the genomic data by like the ancestry sort of companies, where you swab yourself and you send it to them, and then they're connected to other companies which then end up owning parts of that data, and then science and research needing to then buy that data back that's been essentially paid for to send it by consumers, instead of adding to, I guess, this kind of, it goes back to, I guess, some of those solidarity ideas, or some of those ideas that were mentioned in the last session around what is collective data and what does that mean, and, you know, and yes, on the individual levels, what are the ethical or the moral higher points, which I think is really tricky, like what takes foregrounding in terms of, you know, the collective need to have this data versus the individual that might be injured by the data because it reveals something, and privacy. And of course, our trust in institutions like scientists and like government are not always very high. So there's also that kind of, who do you trust with that body of data if someone is going to be given that collective data?
We also talked in the last session, well, one of the things you're referencing about the public good, you know, and, you know, you could say, oh, well, you know, you have this genetic material from a relative that was used to catch the Green River killer, or the Golden State killer rather, mixed up my killers, Golden State killer, you know, yay, public good, surely, you know, sort of serial killer off the street. And yet, you know, here's this person who submitted their genetic material sort of to a database without the intent of that being sort of turned over to law enforcement, you know, for this, you know, so there's so many sticky wickets here ethically that are fascinating to get to grips with.